So my videos are a bit like buses. You wait ages for one, then they're all shit. So I'm doing a video today on replication, which I suppose is appropriate given we're still slightly in lockdown from a virus that specialises in replication, as they all do. So why am I talking about this? Well, it's to keep me off the streets, really. But more mundanely, I've got my map. You may remember my slightly... What's going on there? Oh, that's fine. You may remember my slightly boring discussion about a trapdoor escape hatch from my bunker, which I've now... Oh, hello. Made slightly prettier. I'm quite pleased with that. I did a bit of material work for that as well. I digress, as I am prone to do. So we've tested this out in single player in the editor. This is our familiar looking thing. But oh no, what is this? I said, oh no, what is this? This is a second player who is in the game. That was the blob. He can't see me, but I can see him. And he perceives this escape hatch to be entirely shut. And if he tries to move through it, he can't. Or she, you know, it could be a disembodied lady. But that sounds more like a ghost story than an Unreal video, and I think I know what you'd rather look at right now. But never mind, here we are. So, the situation is that... Let me get out of that again. What happens on a client is only happening on that client, but this is important gameplay stuff and it's not being replicated to the other players in the game. And there's a lot of confusing stuff I can move on to. There's different ways things can work, so we'll just attack it like an Unreal soup and try and pick out the bits we need. I don't know, I'm off on one tonight, I don't know why. Two sets of concepts to deal with. Let me just write something down. I do apologise for the humming in that video, which wasn't a dodgy ground on my microphone. It was actually a 50Hz sound effect in the game, because we can't get enough of dodgy electrical hums in our lives. So, very briefly and probably incorrectly, here is the how things work in Unreal. Oh, good, I can't. Brilliant. So we have a client, which is the person playing the game, and for network stuff, God, I really should have done this a different way. Server. This is one of the worst ideas I've ever had for visual presentations. Let's call it C. So if you have 3 players, there's 3 clients, and there's a server. And everything on the server is the truth, and everything on the client is a version of the truth, which may be out of date. But clients take the truth from the server, and they send information to help the server know what the truth is. So what they send could be, I'm trying to move this way, or I have moved to there, and there may be some conflicts, especially in terms of who shoots who and whatever, and the server is the thing that usually resolves any ambiguity or uncertainty, decides what the truth is, and then tells each client the truth, which is why you get sometimes rubber banding, where you think you're moving in a direction and then you snap back to where you were, because the server told you that you weren't where you thought you were, because the server knows the truth. Or if you've run and then suddenly you're dead 10 feet back, it's because the server is telling you that a while ago somebody shot you, and it's only just come through the interwebs. So that's how it works, but you say, well, I'm playing single player. But what that really is that it's not like this at all, but if it helps to imagine it, that's your computer. And that doesn't really happen, but you know, if a client and a server are in the same box. If you're playing a regular network game, your server is somewhere far away and you join in your house with other people in their houses or flats or apartments or other abodes, fixed or otherwise. And that's a conventional game where that might be hosted by a company in a big room with lots and lots of servers. That's lots and lots of servers. I'm going off on one. Let's start again. And another version of things is a listen server, where a client is also the server. So you're playing your game and that client is authoritative for everyone playing with you. So you have a nice zero ping because you are the server and everyone else has high pings, and you'll generally outperform everyone for that reason alone. Yeah, so there's slightly different configurations. I mentioned this to confuse you really, but also it will be confusing later. So if you're doing networking, you have to plan for both events. So new topic of conversation. So you saw that there were two clients and they were not synced. They had different ideas of what things were in the world. So that was a replication that had either failed or didn't exist. And basically, in your blueprint, say, you might have variables of different kinds, and you might have function calls and events, and to be honest, I don't know if there's any significant difference between the two. They're things that execute. That's the simple version, and one function might call another function in the same blueprint or otherwise, and that might call another function, and there's two ways to replicate to make sure that one client has the same information as another client, and typically it involves telling the server what the truth is and then the server telling other people the truth. So you could say a variable must replicate. So you set a flag and say it replicates. Well, actually you set a thing saying exactly how it replicates, because everything has to be complicated. And then whenever that changes on your computer, your engine will automatically tell the server of a change in that variable, and the server will then push that change to the other clients so they have a version of your truth. Except. Now that's kind of it, but it gets tricky because clients are not the boss of things, the server's the boss of things. So we'll come back to exactly how this works. And a second thing is that a function, you can tell the server that everything needs to execute a certain function, and it will then make all the clients execute that function. And these are for two different scenarios. One is where you just need to make sure a property is updated on all computers when a property changes, and the events thing really is when a thing happens, you need to make sure that it happens everywhere. So with that brilliant exposition, so replication, it doesn't have to be hard, but you have to just think about things. So here is the blueprint for my control panel. I haven't looked at it in a while. And here are my variables. Now let's stick with these. I've got a few things. Lever speed. Now one easy thing I can do is to say everything here, here's replication. So you replicate it or rep notify. Very exciting thing that. We'll come back to that. And you can make everything replicate, but everything that replicates sends stuff between you and the server, and it bungs up the lines. Your tubes get blocked if everything's pointlessly updating. So with replication design, really you want to try and think of how to transfer the information you need to transfer most economically. So in this case, really, there's an animation of the lever, but we don't need to transmit the animation of the lever. That would be overkill. Nobody's going to notice, nobody's going to care. what we need to transfer, well, the things that need to be synchronized, look at it that way. First of all, the position of the trapdoor needs to be synchronized, and the position is an angle of that, and everything adjusts to that angle. It really depends how that blueprint's set up, but if I recall correctly, you basically set a trapdoor angle, and this is it. It sets the variable, and it sets the mesh angles, which I think also sets the angle of the actuators, if you remember that very exciting thing. So one thing you could do is to say, well, the angle we will replicate. So the trapdoor open angle is the angle it should be. If we replicate that, we're good. Yeah, it just gets horrible quickly. No, we don't need that. So if that angle's updated, nothing will happen. We can test it if you want. The reason being that merely changing that angle doesn't do anything. You need to actually call your set mesh angles to actually change all these locations. And this blueprint doesn't know when its own variables change. So you might say, okay, we need to call an event to make it update, but actually we don't, because there is a particular class of replication, which is rep notify, where you are notified when the replication is has happened, and here it is. So whenever the angle changes, you just call that. So here's what I'm going to be proved wrong, but with the trapdoor open angle being a rep notify, I was nearly there. Here is my trapdoor blueprint. Now the blueprint class defaults include replication stuff. The main thing is that by default things don't replicate. This stuff I never play with. That's, advanced. So when you compile it with telling it that it replicates, let's see what happens. Oh, it gets a bit clunky with things. To have in game. So for a listen server, so that one replication is essentially the main thing that we need. If we stop there, that's okay. Never so straightforward. I've just misrecorded a 10-minute stretch of video, so I am in pain. And also the key thing is that what I showed you does not work on a dedicated server. I'll give you the briefer version. What I was trying to do was that when the player enters the overlap zone for the control box, it enables the input, so the player can then press the grab key, and the idea was to send a message to the server to say, I've activated the lever. Server then does the updates the open angle of the trapdoor, and it replicates down, creates a notification, which means that it updates the mesh angles independent on the new value, and everyone's happy, except that you can't send a message to the server from any old actor in the level, which is annoying. It's for a good reason. That you can't, it's not a security risk for cheating or whatever, but only actors that are owned by a player can send a message directly to the server. What that basically means is player characters and player controllers. So given that, alright, so what you can do is route your message through the player controller. Typically people will add little dummy functions so that any actor that wants to talk to the server just asks the player controller to pass on the message, basically. However, I am doing modded maps. I am happy doing modded maps, It means I have bugger all input on what the player controller does. I cannot assume it can do that, and I have no way of making it do that, especially for a game that hasn't yet opened up the modding. So I have to make this work without any recourse to the player controller or player character doing stuff for me. And there's various things I tried, but you just can't get around the fact that any old actor cannot just on a whim send stuff to the server. So I had to change the way I did it. So the key thing is to get past this sort of server boundary. Once you're up there, you're good. So in this case, just to also clarify this diagram, there's a copy of all the actors running on the server and on the client. They may update each other, but they are a separate set of actors, and they correspond to each other. So for every actor on the client, there's one on the server, except where you've specified otherwise. And so when the player enters the overlap zone on the client, it's also doing that on the server. May not be absolutely instantaneous, but the same thing happens. So I need to start with the control in the server, and so when the player does that on the server will then set the owner of the control box on the server to be the client that just entered. So it has an impact on the gameplay in that only one player at a time can then press the grab key, but actually that's kind of good behaviour probably. Well, actually, that would be nicer to have anybody able to do it whenever they want, but it's not a terrible limitation. And when the player moves out of the overlap zone, that's unset. And so now the same thing happens. Once the owner's set, the control box can then send a message to the server's copy of itself, which then does the control, and everything's replicated back. So that works. I'll just quickly show you. I'll show you the blueprint. So I can't remember if I've done this before, but I've simplified the overlap events to call a single function with an indication of whether it's beginning or ending and the actor that's overlapping. And here we go to that function. Just check it's a valid thing. And there's two steps. One is the server-side stuff I just mentioned, and the second bit is the client-side stuff to make sure that the sounds play and so on. And they don't, but we'll fix that. So on the server side, if it's the server, the switch has authority is the thing you want. Just to cast to see it as a character. I don't need to do anything with it at this point. Just going to make that a slightly more handle overlap, just slightly more useful error message. And if we're entering it, you do one thing, which is to again test that the owner is valid. If it's not valid, that means that there's nobody using the handle. So if nobody's using the handle, store the previous owner and set the owner to be, that is the person who just entered the overlap zone. And if you're leaving the overlap zone, you set the owner to be the previous person. And if it was, I need to have a disable input somewhere. That, but that'll happen anyway. In fact, yeah, never mind, I'll come back to that. So that's the server-side stuff. On the client side, it's like it was before, pretty much. Check it is this player on this client. Player index 0 is always the player for the client on the client. If it's not a dedicated server, well, that will also rule that out. But anyway, no, it won't, because there will be a player 0 on the dedicated. So just make sure it's a client and not a dedicated server, and then turn on the input, turn off the input, and do the handle magic. And then when you press the key, the same stuff. It will now successfully call this server function just here. So that is the client, and only the client will get the F key. In the case of a listen server, it has authority and is also a client. So I don't want to do a server check there. So I tell it it's switched, and that then updates the lever. But it also happens on the client side as well, so that the sounds play and the animations match, whatever. And so that's that. Okay, so just to show you that it does work, I'm running a dedicated server with 2 players. Let's. So you can see it's doing it on both. there are some problems. If the sound's not playing, you can fix it. And proof of the pudding is going to be count the other player. Do that while the other player's in the way. So no. If I get the hell out of the way and then switch to this player, so both independently deliver at the same time. And you can see that the lights are not updating, but we can do that in a second. Okay, before I go on, there's one thing I had to spend a long time on, which just was stupid, was that this project is a sort of blank project. Comes with, if you play the level, you get a very basic thing that moves around when you press the keys, and that does not by default. It's not a character. I don't know what. Listen server fine, single client fine, dedicated server it did not register on the overlap events. Don't know why fully, don't care. Basically project settings, maps and modes. This was default game mode was game mode, and when you do that it comes with this stuff, and that just didn't work for me with the dedicated server. If you've made a first person project, then this will be this, something like that. Oh no. Okay. This came with a marketplace thing, but I just hooked onto this. I changed it to the first person game mode, used my test character controller, but a default, I fiddled till it worked. But I had to fiddle with this, so if you're having problems with overlap events not working, check that this stuff is all set up okay. That's all I'll say without going into further detail. So I want to make the lights change, and I'm going to make a big change, well, biggish, just to make it nicer. For some reason failing to find my things, so this is in electrics. Okay, so here is my function for updating the lights. So to get the light set properly, I need to know if it's powered up, I need to know if the trapdoor target meets the state. That's goes from 0 to 1. It's a measurement of how open it is. Another lamp is set based on the current state, which is something, maybe that's the current state. And that's a lot of things. Now I could replicate all of those variables, but that's not so good. So I want to simplify this to the minimum amount of information. So I'm actually going to, if I can remember where find it, I want to make a structure. Blueprints and enumeration. There we go. Control box states. This is more than I need to do. Off. Oh wait. I get very confused. Right. Control box states is what I want. Display name off. Powered off. Closed. Oh, God. You see where I'm going with this. Moving. And so there we go. I'm going to make a new variable which is there. I'm going to put it in controller. Previous owner is orphaned. and I'm going to make that a... Oh, where's it gone? There. And so that's nice, and this is what I want to... No, I don't want to make it visible, I want to replicate it. And I want to rep notify because I want to set the lights based on that state. And so let's do that. And so somewhere I need to set that state based on what's happening. And why not initial? And let's say initial is closed. So that's the initial state. So I'm just going to speed up. That's not a perfect encapsulation of all the possibilities. If it's powered off, is it powered off open or closed? So I'm going to assume closed. If it's moving, I'm just going to say it's open. This may not work very well at all, but that should hopefully do enough. I'm not going to let it be moving when it starts, that's just too complicated. Now going to replace this logic with somewhat more straightforward logic. So that's more straightforward. I'm going to just copy this somewhere else. This will be executed on the server but not the client. The client will take instructions from the server. And that will hopefully do it. We just need to make sure that that state is called at the appropriate time. And let's explicitly make that only server side, so we don't get clashes between values that are set locally and values that the server sets. And I think that's all I need. I don't think I need to do the rep notify on the target state. But but let's see if that works. Alright, so watch the lights. Yes. I'd say that's kind of done. The lever animation could be improved, but that's fine. So on a dedicated server, 2 clients. Let's just double check the other one can still do it. Great, I'd say job done. Now I was going to look at a second thing to replicate, but I think I'm out of time, so maybe in the next video I'll look at the breaking glass. Alright, thank you for your patience.